Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome to Alta Live. My name is Beth Spotswood, and I am the digital editor here at Alta Journal. I am so excited to welcome you all here today, joining us for a discussion with India Mandelkern about her new book, Electric Moons, A Social History of Street Lighting in Los Angeles. In this book, India rewrites LA history through one of the city's most overlooked design legacies, street lamps. It's the most interesting, unexpectedly interesting subject. Like, yes, I do want to know more about LA street lamps. A bit about India. An LA native, India Mandelkern is a graduate of Middlebury College and received her PhD in history from Cal Berkeley. She has written for a variety of publications such as Vice, Curbed, LA Magazine, and the LA Review of Books. From 2016 to 2018, she served as a fellow at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, LACMA, and she currently works for Metro. She lives in LA. India will be joined in conversation with Alta Books editor David L. Ulin, who, forgive the pun, glowingly reviewed Electric Moons for Alta's Monday Book Review. Before I turn this conversation over to India and David, some brief housekeeping. Alta Live is the digital interview series we do here at Alta Journal. If you are unfamiliar with Alta, we are an award-winning magazine and website and events series, oftentimes, focused on California and the West. You'll get this for $50 a year or $3 a month for a digital subscription. You can join us and support the work we do. We host weekly events like this, Alta Live. We host the California Book Club, a once a month book discussion. In fact, this month we're going to welcome Layla Lalami and her book, The Other Americans. And we have live events, including upcoming book parties, issue launch parties at indie bookstores around the West. So follow us, join our free newsletters, come to events like this, and if you're so inclined, subscribe to the magazine. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions for our guest. India and David will chat for about 30 minutes, and then we will get to as many of those questions as we can. This interview will be recorded and posted to altaonline.com later this afternoon. It will also be emailed to you along with a link to David's review, where you can buy India's book and anything else that pops up today. It is so great to be here with our community. I encourage everyone to let us know where they're zooming in from in the chat. And with that, I here in Novato, California, Northern California, will get lost and turn this over to David. Thanks.
Thanks, Beth, and greetings. Sorry, I think I was frozen there. Thanks, Beth, and greetings from Los Angeles, Southern California, where it is due to rain at any moment. So we may have a rainy day conversation. And welcome, India. I'm delighted to get a chance to talk to you about this book, which I think is just fantastic. I'm curious. You talk a bit about it in the book, but I'm curious if we can, why don't we start with just sort of the genesis of this project? I mean, streetlights are a huge component of LA's built environment and have been since the 1880s. But, as with many infrastructural elements of the city, they often get overlooked or just taken for granted. So I'm curious about how you initially got interested and how the book developed.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you so much for having me today. But yeah, that's kind of a funny story. I think maybe kind of predictably, the project started at LACMA, which, as many of you guys know, is the home of Chris Burden's Urban Light, which is probably the most Instagrammed artwork at the museum, if not all of LA. So it was installed in 2008. Last time I checked, it was more photographed than the Hollywood sign. But anyway, I had a fellowship there from 2016 to 2018, and just very fortuitously, when I was there, the 10-year installation of the sculpture was rolling around. And now we already knew that the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation had very generously decided to upgrade all of the incandescent bulbs to energy-saving LEDs. But we wanted to make a very big deal of this 10-year installation anniversary. So I was in all these campaign meetings, and we put everything on the table: street lamp, tattoos, cookies shaped as streetlights, finding people who had their picture taken with the sculpture back in 2008, tracking them down, and this was pre-Instagram days, and photographing their reunion portraits. And I just, I came up with the idea to create a zine of the different street lamp models that were in the sculpture. I think most people, when you pass it by, they don't really notice that there are all these different designs, and they all come from little neighborhoods in LA. So I thought it would be this kind of cool micro history of each lamp. I think part of it was I wanted to do something different. We talked about these lamps all the time as a contained artwork, but I don't think anyone at LACMA really saw these individual poles as artworks in of themselves. So I started getting into that and looking into the histories of the poles, and kind of also very serendipitously, several months before, I was doing a story for Curbed about something else. Actually, the banners that hold on this that hang on the streetlight poles that advertise, museum exhibitions and things like that. And I had met this gentleman in LA's Streetlight Museum, and yes, we actually have one. We started talking. I learned, he kind of introduced me to this whole underworld of street lamp enthusiasts that had these long, convoluted discussions on Facebook message groups, and he knew all these little details about the poles and introduced me to this whole community. So I learned that it was so much bigger than just this one sculpture, and there was just such a deep rabbit hole to fall into. So I put the zine together. The museum director gave it to the board members. We used to sell it in the museum store, and it kind of snowballed into a article and then a book contract and turned into this thing of its own. So yeah, just a lot of just fortuitous connections and conversations I had with people that got me interested in this subject. It was not something that I set out to do. I grew up with a street lamp in front of my house, but never really gave it too much thought until I started thinking about it in this new context.
It's so fascinating. I remember having a conversation years ago with my father about creativity, and I said, whoever designed that street lamp, that's a creative act. And he was like, no, it's not. It's not a creative act at all. It's a bureaucratic act, or it's a civic act, or an infrastructure act. And I was like, but somebody had to design it and think about it. And so I think it's so let's talk a little bit about the artistry. I want to talk some about the history, and certainly some of the stuff that you uncovered in the book. But let's talk a little bit about kind of the artistry of the street lamp. What is first of all, you cite and you close the book with a kind of field guide to for your 40 favorite kinds of street lamps, which I did mention in my review that I hope your publisher will put out as a standalone that I can carry in my pocket. But what are your favorites? Why? In terms of both in terms of utility and also in terms of aesthetics. I think there are both of those are in play when we talk about street lamps in Los Angeles.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, one of the reasons that things that I finally got to think about after I started doing this research was that LA had a very unique streetlight ecosystem, not just in terms of having a lot of poles or having a great diversity of different poles, but it had some of these really unique designs that you don't find anywhere else. And as I started looking into it, you find out about all these manufacturers. You can see them often, their logos on the bases, but there's very, very little about them. These names like, Llewellyn Iron Works and Keystone Foundry and Marbalite and Lelux, and a lot of them are these homegrown LA companies that created designs that not only just for LA, but they would also brag about, sending their designs all around the country. So there's this kind of weird streetlight diaspora throughout the entire country. And I've been to other cities like Aspen, Colorado has these Southwest poles that were originally installed in South LA. And I've seen that in a couple other places throughout the country as well. So I think that LA, we don't really think about it today, but LA did kind of have this reputation for creating a lot of pole designs. It wasn't exclusive to LA. Probably the biggest two of the biggest companies were in Ohio and Missouri. But there were a lot of very, very unique pole designs that came out of here. And I think that there was this weird blend of, I don't know if it's because LA has always been thought of as this city, a new Mediterranean, or it's on the very end of the West Coast. We have all this interesting architecture and this weird sort of fantasy of recreating this sort of Mediterranean lifestyle. But I do see a lot of that reflected in the poles. And so some of my favorite lights are ones where you can really see that. The street light that was in my neighborhood when I grew up, it was called the Lelux 11. Obviously, I didn't know the name until I was far, far older. I probably didn't even notice street lamps very much when I was a kid growing up there. But it has these, it looks like a Greco-Roman column, but it's kind of weird. It looks like it's the flutes in the columns are melting, and there's these crazy designs and this pomegranate motif on the bottom. And so I feel like there's this weird combination of using just kind of a grab bag of different symbols that all these designers had available to them. So I think that the question of, is it, just bureaucratic art, or is there actually some thought that goes into it? An interesting question, because, they are mass-produced designed objects, but there's also a lot of thought that goes into making them different. And why are there so many different styles? And with these little variations in motifs and the way that an urn is shaped, or the size of the base, or some personalizing mark like many streets had in LA that were made specifically for one neighborhood or one street, really sets Los Angeles street lighting apart. I feel like there was this freewheeling experimentation that you don't really see in every city. And that was something that I found exciting, and especially having worked at LACMA and coming from an art history background, exciting for me.
I mean, also it was a matter of civic pride. You write in the book, in the 1880s, when the first electric moons, which is where the title of the book comes from, were built, that there was a real kind of initiative on the part of the city to be at the center of electric lighting, electric street lighting, that they wanted to outdo other cities like San Jose or other cities that were kind of sort of pioneers of electric street lights. And I wonder if you can talk about that. I think it's fascinating in terms of Los Angeles. For me, that history of the streetlights kind of echoes the history of the city, as in terms of the early streetlights being focusing on the sidewalk for pedestrians, but then as the car came in, the streetlights getting taller and focusing more on the road surfaces for the automobile. I wonder if we can talk a bit about the kind of the importance of the idea of electric lighting to Los Angeles's early idea of itself, and then how that idea, how the lights have changed as the idea of the city has changed, or the city's idea of itself has changed.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've given a couple talks about this book, and I show this presentation, and one of the slides that I always show is one of the first article in the Los Angeles Times to come up talking about electric lighting. And I always point out it came out in early 1882 in January or something, and the paper only got started in late 1881. So getting electric lights for Los Angeles was one of the biggest news stories of 1882. And yeah, I think that the story of street lighting in different cities is universal and particular at the same time, because all American cities adopted street lighting between the 1870s and 1890s. Maybe a couple were after 1900, but mostly concentrated in that time. And LA was in the middle of that. And you look at different cities, why they got them, and there's always a combination of reasons. They can be useful for public safety. It was kind of like a policeman that you didn't have to pay for. They would bring prestige to the business district. They were going to encourage people to stay out and shop and spend more money. But the number one reason, I think, is because another city nearby got them. And that's exactly, and this sense of inferiority and keeping up. And I think that's precisely the reason why street lighting became so important in Los Angeles. That first article in the LA Times talked about a giant moon tower that got a lot of press. It kind of was shaped as the Eiffel Tower in San Jose, and everything San Jose wanted, LA had to have too. I did a little bit more research, and the whole idea of the moon tower in San Jose came after, Nevada City got some light and they wanted it. And I think that also has a lot to do with why it's a lot of these Western cities that are first to experiment with street lighting. They have more of this, they have more to prove. They haven't invested so heavily in gaslight. And so, they really have more that they want to do, and they have a little bit more flexibility to experiment. So yeah, LA's story, I think, is quite similar to other Western cities during this time. But I think that as time goes on, just to get to your second part of your question, that as LA automobilized, and we know that this happened a lot more dramatically and than in other parts of the country, street lighting had to reflect the new ways that we were getting around. So I think that if we look at Los Angeles, it's there are a lot of firsts that we've done that have kind of responded to the ways that the city is changing. And I think that installing a lot of overhead poles, we had a freeway system that was incredibly developed and we kind of became known for during the 1940s and 50s. I think that LA kind of made a name for itself just responding to these new ways that people navigated a city and responded to that.
And I think, I mean, it seems to me that that was also an important part of how LA conceptualized itself. We were the city of the future, not the city of the present, certainly not the city of the past, not the city of the 19th century, city of the 20th or 21st. And that notion of technology, whether in terms of road building or streetlights or automobiles or whatever, or speed and light, which I often think of as just sort of, that should be on the Los Angeles city seal, or something like that. That notion, that desire for that kind of, speed and light and futuristic living, it sort of falls into the, I mean, this kind of falls into that notion, that way of civic thinking. Do you think?
Yeah. So I think that, yeah, I mean, we don't think of it this way today because you look at a street lamp and they represent, nostalgia and romance and, all these, come home after the street lights come on, and there's something very backwards looking about these things. But at the time, this was the most revolutionary thing ever. Can you imagine a light that just stays on if it's really windy? I mean, that's wild.
Yeah.
It doesn't flicker, it doesn't smoke. And so having this kind of technology was, meant a great deal, that this was a progressive city. This was a city that was doing something. And all of these LA Times calls, make those kinds of arguments throughout 1882 as we're struggling to get the light and waiting for it to happen and setting up the mass. Oh, but now some of the machinery isn't there, and anticipating this happening, because it's when the lights go on, it's going to be this moment where we're no longer a city in the past. And it's a type of enlightenment, I guess, to use a pun. But I don't think that I don't think it's coincidental that public street lighting really got going, during the Enlightenment in the 17th centuries, and they are related. It does relate to some new awareness about oneself and some new ability to see things that you haven't been able to.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I want to come back, your point about kind of nostalgia and streetlights is a really interesting one, because I think about, let's say if I'm in a neighborhood like Windsor Square, those streetlights, I always feel like I'm in Double Indemnity or some Billy Wilder movie from the 40s. And they have that kind of nostalgic quality, which so they were a progressive creation that has kind of taken on that nostalgia. And it seems to me to be a reflection of the way that we operate with history in Los Angeles, which is to say that the innovation becomes the history, or the artifice becomes the authenticity. I think about, the tar pits or Olvera Street, or all of the things that were built as sort of ersatz creations, but 100 years later now have the weight of use. Do you think about those sort of traditional streetlights, I guess, if that's the right word, in a similar kind of way, that they were forward looking, and now as time expands, their value is both in terms of what their aspiration was in the moment, but also in terms of how we look at them retrospectively?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to characterize it. I mean, Windsor Square, when it was developed during like 1910, 1911, I mean, getting those streetlights in this new neighborhood, billed as, a quote residential masterpiece. And, if you recall, Windsor Square was really exciting. And a lot of the advertisements all circulated around the fact that it had all these improvements that no one had ever dreamt of in their wildest dreams. Like we have these concrete streets and we have all these building restrictions, so every home is going to look perfect. And the street lamps are in all of the advertisements. So I think that there's no other area of Los Angeles where the street lamp is more associated with the aspirations attached to that particular development than perhaps Windsor Square. The lights looked a little bit different back then. They used to have these really fancy glass poles that have been replaced with like an acorn. But I think what's really impressive about walking around there is that those lamps that are in those advertisements from 1911 are the same lamps that you are actually looking at right now. So when you're walking around that neighborhood, you can rest assured that it is the lamp you are looking at is older than the streets, the buildings, the street signs. I mean, it really is kind of the last vestige of what Windsor Square originally was and what it wanted to become.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I wonder, it occurs to me that this sort of street lamp, what you're talking about in terms of the detail work of street lamps, is endemic to sort of the way we think about or engage with history in Los Angeles. It's there, but it's sort of a little bit below the surface, or in this case, let's say a little bit above the surface. And we have to make a kind of a conscious choice to look at it. I'm curious about your thoughts on kind of our collective or civic relationship to our history and how that may or may not be changing.
That's a good question. I mean, I think if you look at the sort of tenure of street lighting over the 20th century and sort of, the golden age and the rise and fall, and now maybe they're being restored and there's more of an appreciation than there was 30 or 40 years ago, kind of parallels the way that we've thought about preserving our past. I mean, the streetlights often kind of fall out of the conversation when we're talking about preservation in most contexts. Most people are worried about buildings or, certain homes and things like that, or, adobes. But, I think that these street lamps are, we've lost so many of them due to, road improvements, safety improvements. And I think that it wasn't until the 60s where we really started to, sort of at the same time where we're starting to notice this more in other contexts about cultural preservation. And after the city had changed dramatically during the 1940s and 50s, that they start to become more of a conversation. But I think that it's taken a lot longer for us to actually do very much. And oftentimes, and this is a shame and maybe something that will change in the future. It's really up to, I think when we're talking about streetlights, like very different people, very different groups come into focus, because it's not really something that there's like a citywide inventory that everyone has access to and everyone knows about. So when it comes to preserving and thinking about our history and what this meant to us, it's often on this very granular level that's, smaller than a neighborhood, sometimes only the size of a little cul-de-sac, where they had a block with these special streetlights. And oftentimes when we look at some of these surviving old poles, there's only 6 left on a certain road or, here or there. So, I mean, it gives us, I think it changes our perspective to look at preservation and history in a completely different way.
That's real. That's a really good point. I mean, it's interesting too that now, I mean, you talk about it in the book. There in 2018 or 2019, there was a competition from sort of spearheaded by the city of LA to create a new streetlight that would be both, I guess, historically resonant in a certain sense, or would kind of reflect back on the history of streetlights while also being super state of the art and, green and, all of that, but also geared towards both pedestrians and the road surface as the city kind of starts to make a move or tries to make a move back to a kind of more pedestrian, it seems strange for non-Angelenos, but a more pedestrian city to create a more, safer and more interactive pedestrian spaces. So I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about the competition and the street lamp, the design that was selected, and how that speaks to this sort of ongoing kind of engagement with both history and kind of the city moving forward into the future.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Well, I was incredibly lucky putting that chapter together because I started writing the book at pretty much the same time that Christopher Hawthorne announced that competition. So I got together with him, had coffee, and he said, why don't you can be the fly on the wall and listen to the competition and all our deliberations and things like that. And then I think that nobody really expected that then the world was going to shut down shortly after the competition was announced. And so all of these conversations are happening on Zoom, in this totally surreal context where sometimes the only things that they're on at night are the streetlights. It's the only thing that's kind of telling you that the city is still running. But what I will say is that there were a whole bunch of submissions. I've seen a lot of them, and it was when the super bloom concept came up, it was unanimous. It was different than anything that we had seen. Everyone loved it. Everyone immediately recalled, even though that it's
Can you
modeled on.
describe this? Can you describe, for those who don't know haven't seen the design or know what it is, can you describe the super bloom?
Yeah, absolutely. So this streetlight concept was modeled on a bouquet of flowers. So it was called Super Bloom. And one of the stipulations of the contest was that it had to, as you said, serve all these new functions to make the streets more livable and walkable for people. Like there had to be a pedestrian light, there had to be some shade concept, there had to be some kind of accommodation for smart city innovations, like a pollution tracker or a camera, and there are dozens and dozens of different appendages we hang from streetlights, to make people's lives, ostensibly to make people's lives safer and make navigating the city easier. So this concept comes along, and it is shaped like a bouquet with different kinds of lights. Like every flower looks like a different light as a different bouquet in the stem, that every new function that the streetlight is asked to serve becomes an additional stem. And I think that even though that concept is, no streetlight has really been designed that way before. And I've never run across anything like that in all my research on historical street lighting. People still found it very evocative, and it really reminded them of these very, very early poles in the early 1900s that had these Beaux-Art globes that kind of looked like electric moons. That's why I named my book that. And it recalled for them something nostalgic, even if they couldn't put their name on it or didn't know what it was or couldn't really give the details. But I think that it looked modern and backwards looking at the same time. And that was what I think really, really resonated with all of the judges.
Yeah. One of the things I would be remiss if I didn't ask about this, and it kind of cycles back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which was Burden's urban light. One of the things that I found fascinating about the book was your sort of capsule history of another streetlight installation, right? Which is Vermonica. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what that is. I'm sure many people don't know what it is, but also perhaps its relationship to urban light, or to the idea of thinking about streetlights as a mass, as as artwork.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, we all, Angelenos all know urban light. I mean, fewer of them realize that there was another streetlight sculpture installed in 15 years earlier, that was called Vermonica. It was named after the streets Vermont Avenue in Santa Monica. It was installed after the LA uprising, as kind of a gesture toward healing and peace, in an area that has been particularly ravaged by the violence. I actually used to live on that corner, and although it wasn't the reason why I decided to write about streetlights, I did notice it, in this shopping parking lot center, 2 blocks from my old apartment. So honestly, that chapter was my favorite one to write, because I think that there's so many levels you can dissect the relationship between these 2 sculptures. One, urban light, built by a blue chip artist that's been famous for many, many years, purchased for millions of dollars, stands at the south entrance of one of the most popular museums in the United States. And then this other project that was really cobbled together with a couple of volunteers and, maybe like less than $10,000 to install it, was never intended to be there forever, but just kind of organically became this neighborhood curiosity. And, this weird gender cleavage that between the two works, whereas the Vermonica was built by a woman, kind of an unknown artist who, didn't live in LA anymore, whereas Urban Light, created by Chris Burden, one of the most famous conceptual artists, of the 20th century. But then as I started digging into it, getting to know the people who actually built these works and hanging out with them and learning more about, their relationship to the artworks, their relationship to the poles, their relationship to the respective artists, you start to realize that there's all these other cleavages that are at play as well. The relationship between the streetlighter, the streetlight expert who built that, who supplied the materials, who built them, who, would never have, who played this outsized role in creating this civic landmark, who we don't know at all, and their names aren't on the artwork and they aren't really remembered. And these artists who are kind of attached to these artworks. And what does that mean about, what does it mean to be an artist? What does that mean to determine what an artwork means and how it's remembered? So I just had a lot of fun playing with all those ideas. And so it was really rewarding to write, just to get to know these people that saw these artworks in such different ways. And I also think that, in addition to this, this gender cleavage, you start to see this weird cleavage in terms of, cultural capital. And a lot of these, builders, they don't even really think of them as these artworks, and they don't see streetlights that way. And to just look at these different interpretations of what these things on the street are doing and what they mean and, what they signify, was super fun for me.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. And I think you make a really good point, because I know from when I was writing Sidewalking and I was talking to Michael Govan, he was conceptualizing the Burden statue, the Burden sculpture or the Burden installation as almost like a colonnade, like Los Angeles's version of the Greek colonnade at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Whereas Vermonica, there can't be a more vernacular kind of, sculptural installation than one put into the parking lot of a mini mall on the corner of Vermont and Santa Monica. So just even in terms of how they conceptualize their constituencies, it's opposing, or it's different.
Yeah, but Vermonica, has all these connections to, being a menorah, being this Hanukkah miracle. It's supposed to be up for a year and it stays burning for like 15 or something. Or, so yeah, I think that, I say in the book that, one is the temple and, one is the altar. And so they do have these weird synergies among each other.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of thinking about it. Let's bring Beth back and we can open up the conversation to some of the questions from
So many
our
questions.
viewers.
Yeah. All right, we're going to dive right in. Tasha Peters, I read a recent article about LA starting to transition to solar street lighting due to environment and also due to theft of wiring throughout the city. Is there a way to keep the beauty of the street light with solar? And will these lights be pleasant?
That's a great question. I've heard about these experiments with solar. I mean, I think that the new director of the Bureau of Street Lighting is kind of looking at every different energy source. He says when I talked to him last, he said he's even looking at wind. But yeah, I mean, copper wire theft is very, very real. I think that it's not specific to Los Angeles, but it's absolutely everywhere. I mean, I know it's a really big issue at Metro too. In many departments around the city. So I don't know what the solar, I think so getting off the grid is an obvious solution for this. I actually haven't seen any prototype solar lamps, so I don't know what they're going to look like, but I think that we have the technology and capabilities these days of making any lamp look beautiful. And if they can preserve the structure and design and sort of the scale, I think, of a lot of these older street lamps, we'll be in good shape. But the fact that we've been able to upgrade a lot of these lamps from the 1910s and 1920s through all of these different technologies, from incandescent lights to mercury vapor, sodium vapor, and LED, I think is a positive sign that we can adopt to this new technology as well.
All right, speaking of beautiful lighting, Heather Sabin asks, the bridge, is it Hyperion Bridge possibly, where all the streetlights were stolen and replaced with temporary lights, looks so awful. Any chance we can get replacements that look the same without using valuable metal?
I can't agree with you more. I remember when that whole kerfuffle happened, and it was just really a bummer. It felt like we can't have nice things without people stealing it. And And I have seen all of the old beautiful poles that are they are just stacked up in the Bureau of Street Lighting's field office right now. I have some pictures of them just with, that no one can really enjoy. And I agree with you that the new poles don't look nearly as magical as the ones that we had previously. I'm not sure what the plans are at the moment for restoring them or getting replicas that people won't steal, but I think that I can definitely ask the guy who would know. And I think that it's just a larger issue that we're all struggling with, that this, aspects of our public life are, under attack. And it's something that we need to think about in a broader way beyond just streetlights, because it's something that is universal and plaguing so many cities across the country.
Janet Alexander asks, is the city of Los Angeles working on reducing light pollution from its streetlights?
It is. So, yes, that's a huge issue that we are still grappling with. I mean, as you know, LA is one of the most light polluted cities in the entire country. And LEDs, I think, it's still kind of unclear how much they actually reduce light pollution, because a lot of when you get upgrades in the mail for LED streetlights, often one of the bullet points is that they're going to reduce light pollution, which seems really great. But I touch on this a little bit in the book, but it isn't really clear whether they're really reducing it, because the fact that we have such cheaper light than we've ever had before is making it so much easier for all kinds of illumination. And much of the light in LA has so much more to do with just street lights, but also has to do with billboards, gas station lights, lights from people's homes, cars, headlamps. That it's really we can't really think of streetlights in isolation when we're talking about confronting this issue. And even though LED lights are supposed to be more environmentally friendly, and in many ways they are, because they require so much less energy, they sort of point light in a very specific direction, instead of these old diffusers that just kind of let them evaporate into the atmosphere. By pointing the light on the ground or on the road, it reflects back up, and so we don't really know if is that creating a net reduction of light pollution when we consider it in combination with all of these other different sources of light in LA. So yes, light pollution is a very big issue, but I think that there's still it hasn't happened yet that it's become something that's so important that is at the top of the Bureau of Street Lighting's priority list. So there's more to come.
All right, one last question, a quick one, hopefully. And I'm sorry if we didn't get your questions. We have so many questions. Buy India's book. The answer may be in there. We will send you a link to do so. All right, Jody says, I have not read your book, but I would love to. Jody, promise to buy it. I was wondering your thoughts on Chris Burden's urban light at LACMA, having worked there with your fellowship, specifically that Jody heard that Michael Govan went to Burden's art space to check on the work originally conceived as street lamps spread around LACMA's campus. They happened to be gathered together to be washed, and it was Govan who sparked the idea in that moment to collect the street lamps in the entry plaza. Is that story true?
Okay, Jody, you definitely need to buy the book, because I talk about the origin of the sculpture in exhaustive detail there. But that they used to be installed around Chris Burden's studio, but that isn't exactly the way that it went down. But yeah, I won't spoil it.
Okay, it's in the book.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you, India Mandelkern. So fun to get to listen to you chat with my wonderful colleague and friend David L. Ulin. This was so fun. I know our audience had a fantastic time. Thank you both so much for doing this today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And folks, before you leave, join us next week. We are going to talk about the whales of Baja with marine biologist, expert Baja whale guy, Stephen Swartz. He's going to join us from Baja to talk about the gray whales of Baja, our cover star for this quarter. So please join us. Check your email later this afternoon. And thanks again, India and David. Take care, everyone.